Welcome back, guys, to another episode of the Gate Guys podcast. Sean Allen here. We will be on the line with Ivo Werlup out there in Dillon, Colorado momentarily. We've got another show lined up for you. This is number 120. We've been off for a little bit here. We actually are planning a bunch of new things. We actually have 2 other podcasts in the hopper, so it's not that we haven't been podcasting, but we're trying to spread them out a little bit. And we've also been kind of going through some personal growth as well as some business growth here, and it's all good because it's allowed Ivo and I to go a little deeper into some things that have been on our minds, and we're going to be sharing some of that stuff with you guys here. Some of it's going to be, I shouldn't share that because I want to get that down in on paper and make sure that we can commit to what we are thinking here for you guys. So I'll just hang that right over your head, a little dangling carrot there for you. But regardless, we've got a great podcast lined up for you here today. We talk about statins and exercise, the good old statin drugs for cholesterol and whatnot, and maybe how we got a lot of that stuff wrong. We'll mention a great podcast over at the Joe Rogan Experience with Dr. Chris Kresser, number 842, which spurred some of that dialogue. You guys need to understand cholesterol, how much of it is dietary, how much of it is physiologically generated from your body because of the status that you throw at it, meaning the sleep that you have, the stress that you have, the food that you put in, the processed foods that you choose, how much bad stuff you drink, how much good stuff you drink. So a lot of this is under our control, and a lot of it comes from just good health choices and exercise, and we talk about that a little bit. And we then go into runners and brain connections and a lot of brain stuff today, and we'll go into a bunch of stuff. But I think this was a good podcast. I think you really enjoy it. So let's just mention our sponsor here, NewBalanceChicago.com. With many stores here in the Chicagoland area, they've agreed to sponsor just a few more shows with us, and we are very excited about that. They're going through some transitions themselves, but nonetheless, they're still making some really great shoes. And we're excited about the shoes that they do have and the lines that they're putting out. These guys are really on top of things, and you're going to see New Balance here in the loop for a long time. They're continuing to experiment with what the things that a lot of other shoe companies are experimenting with, and we'll just leave it at that. If you're doing your homework out there and you've heard some of the other sponsors on our show, you'll see that New Balance is right there neck and neck with these guys, putting out fantastic products. I have several pairs of New Balance that I rotate through in my my cycling of shoes, and they are some of my favorite shoes, I will admit. I do have some other favorites, but I always reach for, particularly in some of my high intensity workouts, I've got some of the original Minimus with a 4mm drop on them, and they are my favorite for that. I really feel the ground on them. I think they've got ample cushion, but I really feel like I've basically got a really nice slipper on the bottom of my foot. Their 980 fresh foams are still top of the list there. I think they boosted from 4 to 6mm heel drop, but that's a trivial change for an exceptional shoe. Remember, New Balance shoes have nice variable widths, so if you've got a wider foot and you've got a bunion, or you've got something in that forefoot that has allowed you to, or is requiring you to have a slightly wider shoe, go over there, check out New Balance. They've got some wider width shoes that'll help you out with that. And they have also done a nice job of making sure that the vamp is nice and tight around the top of the foot, so you can get a wider shoe in the front but not sacrifice it around the foot and the ankle, and making sure that you have a nice fit. Remember, it doesn't really matter how much width you have at the forefront of the shoe, as long as it fits on your foot and controls the motion here. So make sure you go check out NewBalanceChicago.com. Many stores here in the Chicagoland area. You can get on their website and find where they are. Thanks for their sponsorship. We hope you guys will reach out to them. So let's get on with the podcast here. We got a great show. We'll see you guys on the other side. Yeah. What do you say we talk about statins a little bit? What do you think?
This is a really interesting article out of the Times that you sent over talking about statins. And the article, it really, first of all, there's a little bit of surprising info about the people's lack of conditioning when they compared the runners that were taking statins versus non-runners who were not taking statins, and the strides that they had gained. So I guess I never knew that, and I hadn't read that. I knew that they weren't great for, obviously, the hepatotoxic regions, the renotoxic regions, as well as the fact that, your chances of developing rhabdomyolysis are greatly improved with that. But it reminded me of an article some time ago that was written in the British Medical Journal talking about the whole cholesterol thing, because that's what statins do. They lower cholesterol. And the whole thing is like, look, cholesterol doesn't cause heart disease. So, why are you on a statin? It's like probably approximately 25% of your dietary cholesterol contributes to your overall cholesterol, which is necessary for nerve function and all these other things that we have. Cholesterol doesn't come from eating cholesterol. It comes from dietary fat and triglycerides. But anyway, it was really interesting, and I was glad you put that in there.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me, since we're talking about this and it's on my mind, there is a podcast that Joe Rogan did with Dr. Chris Kresser. And gosh, I'll try and put that in the show notes. And he goes into the cholesterol problem, the fat problem, the lies and myths about cholesterol and statin drugs, and kind of what you need to know. And he goes into some really very simple explanations of lipids and cholesterol and triglycerides. And it's really something that I think both clinicians and just the layperson should be listening to. There's no lie. I love Joe's podcast, but occasionally he has these really high intellectuals on, and I've been following Chris Kresser's work for a long time, and so that's a podcast that I'm going to highly recommend. I will put it in the show notes. If I forget, give us a shout out on social media there, and I'll try and get it up. But it's really scary. They mentioned a article published in JAMA, the Journal of American Medical Association, in November last year, 2016, I believe, or 15. I'm not sure. We'll have that in the show notes, though. But they talked about the likely increase in the use of these statin drugs because of this one study. And they proposed that any adults over the age of 40 who even have a single risk factor for cardiovascular disease should start taking a statin in order to lower those risk factors of developing heart disease. I don't know that I agree with that much, if at all. And, after you listen to the Chris Kresser podcast and, do your own homework, you'll probably realize that that's kind of silly. But we're certainly not telling you what to do, and we're not telling you not to do things that your doctors has told you to do. This is your own homework, and those are the questions you should be asking your clinician or physician. But, this was an interesting study that just found that exercise, if you're on statins, cholesterol-lowering drugs, they made exercise more difficult and less beneficial. And they found that the animals, in this case, they moved less. And so there was also an increased risk for type 2 diabetes as well. So if you're an athlete and you're an aging runner and you're on these things, you might want to have a second look and make some other alternative considerations for what you're putting in your body and the effects that it's having on that. So.
And if you have a large murine-based gait practice, it's really important as well. So you shouldn't put your mice on statins.
Yeah, all you mice chiropractors out there.
That's right. Or mice physical therapists or mice osteopaths.
Yes.
It's important because mice need love and they need care too, especially if you're feeding them to your boa constrictor. So anyway.
No joke, folks. There really is carryover, so don't dismiss it just because it's mice. So. But,
absolutely. And there's enough other information out there. In fact, and this is it's on topic, but it's off topic. I've been listening to a lot of different podcasts lately talking more about strength training and what they're finding. And I think we have something in here in the glute section down below talking about this. But basically, lifting weights and doing resistance work is really starting to trump aerobic work in a lot of different ways. I was listening to something just this morning talking exactly about that and about the different types of glucose receptors that are going to be built with weightlifting on cells that are not built with aerobic training. And that's going to help us with glucose regulation and insulin modulation. And we know that insulin is sort of the culprit here. So it was interesting to kind of see that.
Cool. Yeah, I like that we do these neuroscience pieces because I think this stuff is important. It keeps everybody on the tip of what's going on out there. At least we try to. It's the stuff that's current that week, so I think it's valid. And we've got another one here on young runners having stronger brains. I thought this one was right up your alley on the connections in the brain. And I guess my first question before we go into this, because this is kind of a sidebar topic, but it does have some relevance. Did you play several sports when you were growing up, or were you a one sport guy, or were you, purely an academic? What were you doing?
I was kind of a geek and somewhat of an academic. I played soccer quite a bit, and I ran, but I didn't run like organized with school or anything like that. I was always a kind of a solo runner, and I rode my bike a lot. But I would say soccer was probably my sport. I played a little bit of baseball, but I was a way better soccer player.
Okay. Well, and I asked that question because this one's about young runners, and they're looking at, I think, 18 to 25-year-olds, if I'm not mistaken, in this study. Yep. Okay. And, there's a lot of stuff out there. I follow a lot of training sites out there and forums and whatnot, and they're always talking about diversification early on and specialization late. And I was just reading a study. In fact, I'm just going to read this. It wasn't a study, but it was out of humankinetics.com. Kind of interesting here. Positive effects of specialization at the optimal time. So what they're discussing here is that you should be very diversified as a young a child and growing up and playing many, many different sports, and then you should become more specialized as you go on. It tends to round you out a little bit more. I'm going to quote this right from humankinetics.com. Athletes who experienced a relaxed and fun approach emerge more balanced and well-rounded than those who do not. This increases their chances of reaching elite levels in their sport. Youth who try a number of sports and specialize at older ages reach higher performance levels than those who specialize early. Such athletes are less likely to burn out and do not develop the perfectionist attitudes and often come with early specialization. They develop better movement patterns and decision-making skills because they are involved in a range of activities that require a variety of cognitive and physical functions. Being in various sports situations also keeps them mentally fresh and open-minded. And so it goes on, but you get the feel for this. And, I played many sports. I at one point, I think I counted over 7 or 8 in my young years, from tiddlywinks and ping pong to swimming and tennis, golf, baseball, fast pitch, and then things that weren't so specific, but were also a certain degree of variable, racquetball, basketball. I played a lot of basketball in high school as well. And so when you start adding these other sports over there, and I think that's why I'm interested in the things that I'm doing, like jiu-jitsu right now. There's so many different aspects of this. So I really do believe in this very generalized diversification early on in specialization. However, that's just not what we're seeing, at least here in the Chicagoland area in the Midwest of the United States. These kids are picking up a sport, and they are picking it up at a young age, and not only are they playing it in high school, but they're specializing it in clubs afterwards. They're practicing 6, 7, 8 hours a week. They're playing games all weekend, and they're on travel teams. I think it's a huge mistake, and I'm trying to share it with my patients, and thought that I'd share it here today before we went on with this article. Do you have some thoughts on that before I fire off into this article?
I think you're doing a great job. Keep going.
All right. And by the way, I just looked up. Chris Kresser was podcast 842. That's 842 on the Joe Rogan Experience. Really good podcast, about 3 hours, and they go in depth on a lot of things. It's worth your time. Trust me, it is worth your time. I've actually forwarded a lot of patients over to it because he quotes studies and whatnot. So, but let's get back to this. Young runners have stronger brain connections, and they talked in this thing about with the MRI scans. They found that the endurance runners' brains have a greater functional connectivity than those of the sedentary people. And like we had said, that they took 18 to 25-year-old cross-country runners, and they did these brain MRI scans on them. And they found that there was increased activity in the frontal cortex, which was important for cognitive function and executive function and planning and decision-making and stuff like that, as compared to the sedentary group that didn't show the same positive changes. So, we've always thought and we've always heard that, playing a musical instrument, and they do talk about this in the article, and the sports requiring increased hand-eye coordination definitely tend to improve brain function and hit these brain structures in the frontal cortex area. But they're now finding that just a sport like this that is very rhythmic also does it because of the repetitive cyclical nature, but there's also decision making in it as well. Probably not as much as you might think in some other sports, but they're finding that it has the same effects on the brain. And more importantly, they're suggesting that the connectivity that they're finding in these young runners are also those areas that are impacted as we tend to get into the older ages, where these areas of the brain are decreasing in function. So they thought that early adoption of these things is going to have a positive impact as we age. So what did you think on this?
Whenever I see articles like this, it always makes me think of a lot of stuff. So, young runners have stronger brain connections. Well, right. What about young rock climbers? What about young baseball players, soccer players? Any activity where you're going to have increased balance and coordination requirements, particularly activities which are repetitive, are going to increase the amount of synapses that you have in your brain. This is not rocket science. We've known this for years. It's all part of the learning curve. So we could have easily put young rock climbers have stronger brain connections, or young canoers, or young, fill in the blank gymnasts. It's just that running, biking, and a few other sports get all the attention. So it's not rocket science here. We have, running requires one, visuospatial orientation, so we've got a large proprioceptive component. Whenever we invoke the proprioceptive system, we invoke the cerebellum. And the cerebellum has the most neurons of every place in your entire brain. It's all concentrated right there. So you're going to build these synaptic connections in this area because the cerebellum is involved with almost every aspect of not only movement, but also learning. So it's not surprising. It's great to see the information coming out. And, the bottom line is, look, get your butt up off of the couch and do something. It's this whole, sitting is the new smoking thing. When people are active, they're going to do better. Just like we see, I think we talked about it several pods ago, people that exercise more have decreased cognitive decline as they get older. Well, of course they do, because we're using the muscles, and we're utilizing the different synapses and pathways in the brain. So no rocket science and nothing really new here. Nice to see that they're putting this information in there, and that this is getting out into the general public. This is futurity. A lot of people read from that area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. It really isn't rocket science. It's just good. There's a large population of people, of our listeners, that are runners. But, it's nice to have some support of what you do. But you're right. It could be. And, rock climbing is a great example. We've talked about it before, where you're kind of parsing out the the motor neuron pools of the upper limbs and the lower limbs in a way that you don't do it in many other activities, because we don't do a lot of other activities quadruped. So I would argue that might actually be, talk about decision making and, critical decision making and timely decision making with all four limbs. Very interesting stuff. So it's just nice to see that the research, we can now do this with fMRIs and whatnot. So it's nice to see. So we've got another one. The Science Alert basically did the same review. We'll put that in the show notes as well. So shall we talk about glutes? You know what I wanted to mention, because we were kind of talking about motor neurons. You did a great piece on bite plates or mouth guards, and we've talked about that a long time ago. But do you want to just mention it just in passing here, since that actually has an impact on cortical function?
Sure. There was an article in the November 16th issue of one of my favorite journals on the planet, Lower Extremity Review, talking about mouth guards improving athletic performance. And of course I read it with great interest, because basically you're looking at converging motor neuronal pools, activating or increasing activity in the cortex, kind of like the Gendrasic maneuver when you're doing somebody's reflexes. So if you have somebody you're testing their reflexes and their reflexes are not coming out or you can't elicit them, then there's a number of different things you can do. You can have them contract the muscle lightly. You can have them clench their teeth, make their hands into a figure eight and pull them apart. Basically what you're doing is you're preloading motor neuronal pools, and you're taking advantage of convergence. And in this particular case, you're taking advantage of convergence on the cortex, but in the case of a reflex, you're taking advantage of, convergence on the anterior horn neurons in the cord. In other words, the ones that are going to move things. So they just did a big expose, and I would, read our post. It's on our website as well as our Facebook feed. But go into Lower Extremity Review, and gosh, if you've been listening to us for a long time, you already know this. But what an awesome free journal for people that study movement and movement science. You can it's free. You can get it on the web. The web version comes out 2 to 3 weeks after the print version does. So there are there's a little lag there. But it's a free journal, and if you want to, you can contribute to their cause. But there's always some great information that's going to be in there, and this was just one of them. So yeah, basically biting down or firing another motor neuronal pool makes a difference. Now, mouth guards are a little different because what cranial nerve, are we activating mostly when we bite down? We're activating cranial nerve 5, right, the trigeminal nerve, because it does our muscles of mastication, the ones that help us to chew. Well, the important and really cool thing about cranial nerve 5 is if we look at a brainstem, right? So the brainstem has 3 parts, right? The medulla near the near the bottom, the pons in the middle, and the mesencephalon and the midbrain up top. And then we have the cervical spinal cord, of course, down below. The 5th cranial nerve, the trigeminal nerve, has 3 sensory nuclei, and they travel all the way up into the midbrain, all the way down to the spinal cord. So any input from the face or facial area gets a double bang for the buck, not only going up to the brain, but also from the cervical spine. So we're going to have all of this increased convergence of information. So I could get increased strength if we were to do bicep curls on one side, and we do how many can you do at a certain weight, and you take the opposite side and you clench your hand, you'll maybe be able to do 1 or 2 more or a little bit more weight. If you clench your teeth, that percentage will actually go up because we're feeding that motor neuronal pool that much greater, and that's probably why mouth guards seem to work so much better, or a bite plate in this particular instance. And we have to be careful, too, because if people have occlusal problems or something like that, that can certainly contribute to what's going on. But anyway, that's the long version of the article review.
Yeah, and it's worthy to mention that I wear one in jiu-jitsu. People are always asking why I do that. And I said, well, one, the mouth guard was about $100. It's custom made, custom fitted. The one I use is called Gladiator. And they have different types. Very interesting. They have different types of materials that they will layer in there to cushion shock absorption. If you happen to get, an errant elbow into the chin or something like that, it protects it. But I also say, look, it's cheaper than a dental procedure to fix a tooth, but also there's a performance benefit, which most people don't know. So go check out Gladiator mouth guards. They send you out a mold. You literally bite into it. They send it off, and they will make a custom mold for you. It's the same company that LeBron James uses. A lot of professional athletes use it, and it's a really nice mouth guard. So I've even told some patients that don't want to spend gobs of money on a bite plate for the nighttime because they're bruxing and grinding their teeth, which can create some fractures in the teeth, to just go ahead and order one of these things. It does the same thing, and it's a fraction of the cost. So, and you get 50% reduction for reorders if you keep your mold. So they send it back to you. So something to think about.
I love it. A biohack. Those are great.
Yes. But certainly if your dentist has some suggestions, don't take my suggestion. Go with your dentist. So,
Absolutely. And if you ever need to, now we'll have dental records of you as well. So
there you go. So let's talk about the glutes. We got a lot of stuff here. We bored a lot of stuff for some fodder over time from various sources, but one source that's been hitting it hard is what's his name now? He's over at Strength and Conditioning Research.
Brett
Chris.
Contreras.
Brett is Brett, I think, helps him, but this is done largely by Chris. Oh gosh, I'm embarrassed now. I read his stuff every day. I'll find it. But why don't you start in on some glute stuff there? I'm going to find this, and then I'll start chiming in.
Well, I put up a post last week. This is January 13th that we're recording this. And it was looking at actually a photograph of a statue that you had put up for another post talking about forefoot striking. But basically, I was talking about, what are some potential things wrong with this particular statue, which it's still dubious. Was it running? Was it walking? Whichever. But there was a noticeable lack of hip extension, and that's what I kind of said, well, what do you think is wrong, if anything? And so what are some ways to increase hip extension? And we got some really great replies from our readers and listeners out there as far as ways to increase hip extension. So, some of the more common ones were one, physically just work on the hip flexors and loosen them up, and that certainly would work. And two, strengthen the hip extensor mechanism. Your stabilizing musculature like your iliocostalis, your quadratus, your multifidus, as well as the actual extensors, which are going to be hamstring, glute, things like that. And those were more obvious. And then we started to get into like a little bit more interesting ones, like increasing ankle rocker, and increasing the amount of ankle dorsiflexion is going to help you to get into more hip extension. And then folks got into other ones, like, take advantage of reciprocal inhibition. In other words, contract your hip flexor, which would reciprocally inhibit your extensor while you're stretching. And then during activity, activating your extensor consciously would reciprocally inhibit your flexor. You could use crossed responses. So if you activate your hip flexor on the left, you're going to activate your hip extensor on the right. There were tonic neck movements. If I rotate my head to the side while I'm extending my hip, I can get increased input into that area through TNRs. But there were just lots of great information, and it was interesting to read some of the things that folks utilize, to get increased hip extension. One I thought that was one of the more creative ones was somebody wrote in, increase first metatarsophalangeal joint motion. So really basically increasing the amount of dorsiflexion of the great toe, which will assist you in getting in there as well. Firing into those extensor motor neuronal pools. Simple things, extend your head. Look at good sprinters, people that put their head down versus put their head up. Look at how much more glute strength they can get from simple extension, which is just a simple neck extension reflex. So anyway, that was kind of cool to put out there. I know it wasn't a very long post, but there was a lot of great information. And if you haven't seen it, go back, look for the statue. And the post starts out, how many ways can you increase hip extension? Getting back to this guy from a few days ago, ... And then we talk about it. But it's a great thread to read through. We had quite a few people chime in on that one.
Yeah, and it did lead down some interesting paths. The thing that was common in all of those was that these were very very productive means of getting more hip extension. But we all have to realize that the body doesn't always do things for the right reason. Sometimes, like you said, they might not have ankle dorsiflexion or sufficient ankle dorsiflexion, and yet the body knows that it needs a little bit more requisite hip extension in order to, complete the task. So they might pronate more through the foot. So these are kind of the negative things you want to look for. Look for knee hyperextension. Look for increased lumbar extension. But then there's going to be things like they may go into more external hip rotation or abduction, because we know that those things will increase glute function and hip extension. So, increasing hamstring or adductor magnus strength or activity will also help, tag up the glute a little bit more, because those are synergist for hip extension. So there's a lot of ways, and, a pod or two ago, we talked about you could build a practice around ankle dorsiflexion and hip extension. And once again, we're back on that topic again, pounding it to death, because it is a critical pattern. I mean, and if you're walking, you're moving through hip extension through the sagittal plane. If you're playing just about any running sport, you're going to spend a fair amount of your time moving forward through the sagittal plane, which means you better be able to get to your glutes and stabilize the pelvis in that frontal plane or sagittal plane, and have enough toe dorsiflexion, or hallux dorsiflexion, ankle dorsiflexion, as well as hip extension range, and then be able to protect those ranges with enough lower abdominals and things like that. So this gets a little convoluted. If we're talking fast, go back and just listen to it a couple times. If you've been with us for a while, this is stuff that we've just beat the dead horse with over and over again. But so I did like that post. I'm glad that you kind of took it and spun it that way a little bit. The gentleman's name at Strength and Conditioning Research is Chris Beardsley. He's really doing a great job. If you do not follow him on social media, you need to. Just follow Strength and Conditioning Research. And I think he works very closely with, you said, with Brett Contreras, because I always see him post the same thing. So who knows? Maybe they're just good buddies and they just work in tandem. I don't know.
Maybe they're the same person.
Yeah, there you go. Superhero. Did you go into some of those posts from Strength and Conditioning that I sent over? Did you look at some of those?
I did. And
there's good stuff there.
He writes a lot of good stuff, and what I like about it is it's all research-based. And I've certainly used Strength and Conditioning Research information when I do a big diatribe on basically the quads and VMO activation, which is always a favorite of mine. It's like people selectively activating the VMO for patellar tracking disorders and things like that. And I used a bunch of stuff that they had in a series of articles that they did to talk about that. But anyway, why don't you talk about this next one that you have along here from Strength and Conditioning Research, talking about the hamstring and adductor magnus.
Let's see. Well, I kind of just mentioned that. They were looking at the fibers, the glute max, and they were looking at those fibers moving into. Let's see. I don't know if I'm looking at that one or not. Yeah, the gluteus maximus contributes to hip extension along with the hamstrings and adductor magnus muscles. They go in. He goes in and discusses the glute max is perhaps the laziest of the bunch. It tends to reduce activation, particularly when the hamstrings are more highly activated. I have to agree with that.
Definitely.
I mean, something else has to kick in, and since it's a synergist for the glute, your hamstrings are going to kick in. And, the big question on that one is, with a lot of coaches, is this why I'm getting a lot more hamstring injuries and tears and pulls and strains and whatnot? And, the answer is possibly. Your clients, your athletes might not be using enough of the glute and firing it appropriately, particularly in short track running and on turns and stuff like that. And we've discussed that previously. But this one goes into looking at when the knee is bent to 90 degrees while the hip is fully extended, it maximizes the gluteus maximus activation. And so if you look at some of just a simple supine bridge, have your knees at 90 degrees at the top end of that bridge, and you're probably going to get more glute max activation. And if you don't believe us, go ahead and go into that position and put your feet out further, so your heels are further away from your butt, and now come into your bridge. You're going to feel yourself recruit more hamstring. So, the further that goes, it's going to be harder to activate the glute, and the hamstring will kick in a little bit more. So when I have my clients do bridging, if they just kind of repeatedly are cramping into the hamstrings, I have them bring the heels closer to the butt, and it tends to shut it down right away because you're recruiting more glute. This goes right along with the posturing in Brett Contreras' hip thruster. He's in a supine position, so certainly looks like he's doing everything right, and I rarely find anything wrong with anything that he's doing. So it's always very well science based and accounted for. Do you have anything else to add to this one?
I really liked, number one, make sure when you're trying to get max glute activation, taking the hamstring out of the picture by flexing the knee. One thing I would really have to say when you were talking about bridging and hip thrusting that I see a ton is I'll have patients, and I know you do this too, I have them put their hands on their hamstrings and I have them attempt to do a bridge. And if they can't bridge without firing their hamstrings, then we don't even let them do a bridge. So the point is I want pretty much all glute contraction and minimal hamstring contraction to do that, you know what I'm saying, to go up into a bridge. And I thought that this was really impossible, and I had seen Stu McGill talk. He was actually in Denver a few years ago, And he had us go through a series of things. This was the low back, performance lecture that, I know that you've seen as well. Anyway, he had us go through this and, a novel method for getting people to turn their hamstrings off. And everybody knows what a bridge is, hopefully, at this point. But if you can't do a bridge and while you're doing the bridge, you can't just fire mostly your glutes and minimally your hamstrings, then you shouldn't be you haven't earned your right to do that bridge. So a good way to do this is, imagine if you're lying supine, your legs are bent. We always start people at about a 90-degree angle. But like you said, the closer you bring the heels to the butt, the more hamstring cramping and stuff you can take out of the picture. Put them in that position, and if they can't do a bridge coming up just using the glute, then what I have them do is push their feet down into the ground and push themselves almost like they were in bed and they were trying to push themselves up towards their pillow, but not let themselves move. So the shoulders stop you, and the force of your quads basically assists in your glutes in getting you up. And by firing your quad, you're going to reciprocally inhibit the hamstring and take more of it out of the picture. So just a little biohack there, or exercise hack, I guess, that you can do while you're doing this with your patients. And I don't remember if you showed me that or if somebody else showed me that, because I remember at one time, we were doing a lot of spending more time together. I was in Chicago and you were here, and we were going back and forth and doing stuff. But that was just something that helps me out a lot, because that's a nice isolation and it's also a closed chain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of little tricks, and some of these articles that we're going to discuss, they talk about if you can abduct the leg a little bit and get into a little bit of external rotation, you're going to get more glute, and we know this. That's just fiber orientation, anatomy, and activation patterns. So just putting a band around the knees and having them pull the knees apart will actually help them get into the glute and shut the hamstring down, because you're forcing abduction and external rotation. So a nice little hack there. So
yeah, and if you think about the glute and the fibers, you have fibers. You have the iliac fibers, you have the sacral fibers. So the sacral fibers are largely external rotators and extenders. The iliac fibers are largely extenders and external rotators. And then you have the coccygeal fibers, which are actually adductors. But a lot of these all have the common scenario or the common action of external rotation. So if you bring the origin and the insertion closer together, in other words, you make that muscle a little bit shorter, it's going to be that much easier to activate. Of course, mid-range is about best, so if you fully externally rotate, that's not good. If you fully internally rotate, then you're too stretched. You're looking for something in between. And of course, that's going to depend upon torsional deformities that you may have in the femur, lower leg, as well as at the talus, to where the people's feet naturally fall. So if you're looking at where they fall naturally and where their knees are, just externally rotate them, let's say 15 to 20 degrees, and then have them do the same thing again. We'll actually start people in full external rotation with their legs straight to get them to just, what does it feel like to fire your glute? And I always tell people, it's like, because people do that, and it's like, I'm doing it right. And it's like, can you fart right now? They're like, what? It's like, you should be able to fart, because you're not contracting your sphincter. You're contracting your glute. And a lot of people think that, oh, my glutes are my sphincter, but they don't realize that you really need to separate the two. Anyway, it's just part of that whole neural training.
Well, and they get into that, the sphincter is pelvic floor, and they get into these, chronic pelvic floor overactivity. I always use the example of, chewing a piece of gum for 12 hours and tell me how your jaw muscles feel. We know that increased tone over a period of time becomes painful. And, chew a piece of gum for 12 hours, and you're going to have some pretty sore jaw muscles, and you're going to have perceived tightness. So if you're clenching all the time, particularly through the pelvic floor, you're going to have probably some pelvic floor problems, and sexual dysfunction, painful sex, problems going to the bathroom, painful defecation, etc. So lots of different things. You need to be able to get the glutes on, and that's not to say going into a posterior pelvic tilt and cranking up the glutes is the answer either, because now you're in a posterior pelvic tilted position. That might be great for activation and in some of the training positions, but and that has value. But keep in mind that that's not a functional position, posterior pelvic tilt driving off with hip extension with your glutes, because you can't do that if you're in a fixed posterior pelvic tilt position. Conversely, try standing up and going into a far anterior pelvic tilt position, and you may have to throw your back into a little bit of a lumbar extension to do that, or hyperextension, but you can't contract your glutes in that position either. So that far position, furthest from posterior pelvic tilt, meaning going into anterior pelvic tilt, has some limitations too, some serious ones, because then you're going to be into an altered hip extension pattern, thus recruiting the hamstrings and the paraspinals, and putting a lot of vulnerability into the anterior hip joint, creating some of those cam and pincer type phenomenons with anterior labral impingement, or acetabular impingement, if you will. So, a lot of clients, as I've found out over the years, they don't even know where neutral pelvis is. Some of them can't even get into posterior anterior pelvic tilt, especially the ones who've been living in anterior pelvic tilt. Finding posterior is strange, and even getting them to neutral feels like a posterior pelvic tilt to them because it's such an extreme in the other direction. So there's a lot of learning here that is required for some clients who are in these extremes, but trying to find the glutes for a lot of people, surprisingly, is a real problem. And I think there's no question and no surprise that there's such increased tone in the hamstrings, and people can't even do a forward hinge and touch their toes because there's so much activity or tonus or shortness in the in that posterior hamstring chain. So a lot of simple movements and just teaching someone how to properly hinge forward at the waist and at the hips to touch the toes, and getting them to displace their body mass posteriorly. So many people, when you ask them to touch their toes, they literally just bend forward, but they don't displace their body mass posteriorly and move through the hips. They're just moving through the lumbar spine. So there's a lot of little pieces that come in with this, and this kind of is what makes this this kind of work difficult, because on the surface it can look quite simple, but when you get into all these little nuances and intricacies of how this whole chain works together, it becomes a real difficult job. And to throw a little curveball at that, all the things that we think about when we think about hips, and the glutes are, hip extension. You think of the glutes, the hip extension, hip abduction, hip external rotation, just because of the fiber orientation. Trunk extension, which you've enlightened us on many times before. Posterior pelvic tilt, like I just mentioned. But think about this in the closed kinetic chain. When that foot's on the ground, what looks like external hip rotation is actually rotation of the torso in the opposite direction, because now the pelvis is rotating on the fixed acetabulum. So it would be synonymous with stepping on the right foot and then making a cut to the left in a soccer game. That's actually external hip rotation. But we tend to think of these things from an open kinetic chain because that's the easiest way for us to assess them. So don't forget to turn your brain around and look at some of these things that your client can or can't do well, or when they're having pain. Gosh, I have pain when I step on my right foot and pivot off to the left direction. Okay, that's external hip rotation, stabilization, and and mobility. So maybe we need to look at that as well as external rotation. So just wanted to throw that little kind of curveball in there, because we tend to forget that the foot is fixed on the ground in a lot of these types of injuries.
So since we're on the subject, I'm going to put you on the spot just for a second. Okay. So what are some of yours, and then I'll share some of mine, but what are some of your rehab tricks or hacks that you use when people have difficulty firing their glutes? I mean, and we talk about this, and it is a problem, although sometimes it's a sign of a bigger problem. It's not just like, we'll give them a bunch of hip thrusts to do and that's going to fix their world. But what are some of your tricks for getting people to realize, one, where their glutes are, and two, get them to fire? And then I can go into a few that we use in our office as well. I know we use a lot of similar ones, but I just want to kind of get your take on it, because I'm sure people want to know. They're like, all right, I know I can't fire my glutes, but what do I do about it?
Yeah. Well, I tend to always start with a bridge with the knees at 90 degrees, only because that's one that most people do in yoga class. They've done it in physical therapy. And if they can't feel the glutes, and a lot of times they just feel the dominance of that hamstring, I will put the band around the knees, and I will have them push out into the band and abduct the leg a little bit. Most people can feel the glute function from there. I will have them use that and then go through the bridging type motions there. One of the things that I find is that people who do bridges and do single leg bridging back and forth, they do it wrong. And a lot of this is wrong in Pilates classes and yoga classes. Now, I'm not speaking to those of you who are doing it correctly and teaching it correctly, but there's a lot of people that are a little sloppy with it, and I thought I would just mention it here. And I mentioned it in probably more detail in the podcast I did for South Loop Strength and Conditioning, which we put up on many sites here on our stuff, but I'll try and remember to put it in the show notes. But if you just type in South Loop Chicago Strength and Conditioning podcast, Sean Allen, you'll have some of that stuff there. But have your clients go into a bridge position and put their feet together and just have them do a bridge. They may have troubles finding their glutes. Have them lift 1 foot off the floor, just 1 inch. Can you feel the glute? Obviously, if you lift your right foot, you're going to be into your left glute. People have problems with that. Increase your foot width distance, and you'll find immediately you have to have more glute and more core stability. That's one of the challenges that I do with my clients and the other thing that they do wrong is they move too fast. This needs to be an ultra slow motion activity, because then they have a chance to feel what's firing first, the hamstring or the glute. And that's those are the 2 big mistakes. They move too quickly and they don't separate the feet enough. And so that's kind of where I start, adding the band. If I have to, I have them just show me what a typical squat looks like. And a lot of folks, their squat is actually a forward knee hinge, not a posterior hip hinge. So I know that they're actually not even recruiting a proper movement pattern when it comes to a squatting type posture. There's just too much forward knee flexion. Then that brings in that whole problem of ankle dorsiflexion too, and not enough abdominals, and not knowing what neutral spine is as well. But let's not go down that rabbit hole. There's a lot of the Turkish get-up type postures, the initial movements that are kind of DNS based, from Collage's work out of the Czech Republic, in turning over. A lot of the diagonal sitting type postures, I'll have them try and get into that posture and just find the glute. These are very hard to explain from just words. Pictures are worth 1,000 of them. So, I have a lot of folks just do a kind of a split squat type squatting position. I'll have them put a chair behind them, and I'll have them slide over. So what do I mean by that? So imagine just having a chair behind you, and you go ahead and you go into a squat position. I have them push their hands forward while their butt is pushing back towards the back of the chair. Then I'll have them slide over to, for example, to the right. So the right foot now is along the side of the chair, and I'll have them kind of go onto the ball of their foot. So that right foot is now kind of right beside the back leg on that right side of the chair. The left leg is in front of the chair, but maybe over the right front leg of the chair. So they're kind of, looks like they're going to sit on their left butt cheek on the side of the chair. I have them then go into that type posture so they feel like they can go into a squat, and in this case a split squat, and it allows them to find the glute a little bit better. And it also helps them control the pelvis position because they've kind of got that back leg as a kickstand, plus they've got the safety of the chair. That has been a lifesaver for a lot of clients that have no idea how to hip hinge, how to get into the glutes, and how to do proper hip extension and use the glutes through hip flexion as they go back down into the eccentric part of the squat. So there's a lot of things that I do, and I think you will agree that you can't really fudge. You have to fudge each client because each person is just so different. The task and the exercise is going to be different for someone who is more posterior pelvic tilted than someone who is anteriorly pelvic tilted. And so there's a lot of little variables there in what you're trying to teach. But that's kind of where I start with my clients. And a lot of that is just, let me see what you can do and tell me what you feel, and let's see what it looks like. So just keep in mind that when you're doing the bridges, at least from the supine position, a lot of people think that glute hip extension isn't actually that. It's actually lumbar extension. And those are the clients you realize, oh my gosh, they don't even know what neutral pelvis is. So then you got to help them find the lower abdominals and say, you cannot go into that high of a bridge because that is not, you're going into more lumbar extension than hip extension. So those are the clients that I then stand up immediately and say, look, I'm going to put you in that same anterior pelvic tilt position. Tell me if you can squeeze your glutes. And they can't. And I said, so exactly. I can't have you lie on your back and do a bridge in that same position because you're not going to find your glutes there either. So you have to take those clients and really throw them into a posterior pelvic tilt and teach them how to find it. The problem is that's not a real functional position for the glutes, but the studies show, and strength and conditioning research, Chris Beardsley, Brett Contreras, these guys have shown that recruits a ton of glute. The problem is it's not real functional, but sometimes you need to use exercises to achieve a means to an end. So go ahead, take the floor a little bit and go ahead and critique whatever you'd like, because I'm open to learning here.
Oh, no critique at all. I think for those people that can't, find their glutes, and they've checked lost and found and every place else for it, if they can't do the simple movements like you've described, a couple things that we'll do to try to improve, one, can they lay supine, and can just contract just their butt, not their sphincter, but just their butt? If they can do that supine, can they do it seated? If they can do it seated, can they do it standing? If they're having trouble even with that, we found a couple different methods, can be really good for initiating activation. Number one, simple manual pressure origin insertion. Going around the perimeter of the glutes, around the iliac crest, as well as around the sacral attachments and along the TFL posterior aspect there. Just doing compression in those areas, and basically we're not talking light little, woo-woo touching. We're talking like compression. There you're eliciting a small amount of discomfort. We're activating the nociceptive activating system. We're getting some muscle activation. To support that, we may use K-tape. And we'll K-tape the glutes in sort of a Y or a finger pattern running from either the iliac crest or the sacral or the coccygeal portion, depending upon which portion of the glutes seem dysfunctional and aren't firing. And then the people get that constant small amount of proprioceptive input, which is going to be there. Of course, in the office, I use needling a lot. We might dry needle the glutes, or we may use some muscle activation where we needle the perimeter of the glutes with small needles, and then I'll have the people do a series of glute contractions or leg extensions in a prone position while they're, supine or whatever. So we'll use that as a little bit of a hack. You could use regular tape. You could use, literally you could slap somebody's glute. Of course, that's not clinically appropriate, but, if you, but a lot of times you can get it to contract, because partly sometimes they can't make the cortical connection. You know what I mean? They literally like have glute amnesia. They can't find them. It's almost like a dissociative phenomena. So we'll go through that, and then we'll take them through a lot of the steps, that you're doing. I use a lot of helicopters and airplanes. That's like my go-to glute, as well as I do potty squats quite a bit, which I know you use in your office quite a bit. So it's very similar to your chair maneuver. We call it stand sit. So people are doing a potty squat down, and they're activating their glute by maintaining their lumbar lordosis, flexing their knee but keeping their tibia vertical to the ground. So they're flexing their knee by bringing their butt backwards and going into a seated position and coming back up. We may augment that with a little bit of internal rotation of the heels. So the feet are planted, and you pretend you're Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, and you're trying to bring your heels together, but you're literally leaving them on the floor. So do we really want to externally rotate every single time we stand up? No. But the point is, if you can't find your glutes, these are all good little hacks to help you to find your glutes. And then once you find them, I'll tell people, it's like, all right, so you're in your car, right? You have an automatic, right? So you can drive with one hand. Stick one hand under your left glute, and as you're going down the road, contract your glutes. Can you feel it contract under your hand? And if you can't, then we need to go back, kind of to square one and get that muscle to help activate. And a lot of times we find, and we use the acupuncture quite a bit, 1 or 2 sessions of that, and people are like, holy smokes, I never knew that my glutes could do that. I went out for a ski, and I couldn't believe how fast I could go, or whatever, fill in the adjective that you want. Mm-hmm. But those are just some of the little hacks, and I know we could probably have an entire podcast just talking about little things that we do, but those are little tricks that we use that have been, and that's stuff that I've picked up from yourself, your physical therapist that you had in the office a while ago. I believe her name was Lois. I learned quite a bit from her. People that I've interacted with, talking at seminars. I'm constantly learning from my students when I teach. They're always like, well, did you ever think about doing it this way, Doc? And I'm like, ooh, I didn't, but that's really cool. Let's explore that. And I used to have EMG in my office, so I subject a lot of people to, off-the-cuff EMG studies on the spot when I was trying to figure things out, because it would, EMG is pretty objective, and you're going to get the data, and you're going to be able to utilize that right away. But anyway, I just, I always like to listen to you because you always have great ideas with rehab stuff, and you put things so much more simply and eloquently than I do. If you ask you what time it is, you'll say, it's 1:15. And if you ask me what time it is, I'm going to tell you how to build the internal mechanism of a clock. So it's kind of nice to have it distilled down. It's like, oh yeah, I wouldn't have thought of explaining it that way, but that's like way better than, my explanation. But anyway, I just thought our listeners would really like to hear some of the clinical insider stuff that we do, because, the glutes are huge. We could talk another time about, like, how do you increase ankle dorsiflexion? What are some of the little hacks and tricks that we do for that? And hopefully, if we can get things together between your schedule and my schedule, if we end up doing a live event in the fall, we can talk through some of that, or and some of our upcoming educational, lectures that we're hoping to add. Right now, we teach once a month on online CE, and we're hoping to add another venue on one time per month, where it'll be much more in depth than what we do on the other venue.
Mm-hmm. And less formal in terms of, you don't have to be a doctor, you don't have to be a physical therapist. Anybody can listen in. But I think what I took away from yours was that you probably have a frat house paddle, and I can just imagine your office. You hear people screaming, and I can hear Ivo in the other room. Squeeze your glutes. Whack. Squeeze your glutes. Whack. I said squeeze your glutes.
Yeah, we've been known to do some very unconventional things in the office, but, we get really good results. And anybody that's come to the office had said that. So they're like, the exercises are a little weird, but they work. I had a gal come in with plantar fasciitis the other day, and she says, well, nobody ever gave me exercises for my feet. And I had to, stop from laughing and choking. I'm thinking, oh my gosh. And you've had this for how long? But it is what it is. And she's in the right place now.
I had a lady in just yesterday, and she's a chef for someone very famous here in Chicago, and she works 3 months of the year, but is paid for the whole year. It's an amazing job. I was cueing her on those questions a lot, but she says, look, but during those 3 months, I'm on my feet all day long. And she walks in with these flat dogs, and I just said, hey, raise your toes. And I said, what happened to your arch? She goes, oh my gosh, my arch just went up. And I said, yeah. I said, I think we need to give you some foot homework. And she goes, why hasn't anybody done that? Same thing that you just said. And I said, because it makes more money stuffing a $700 orthotic underneath your arch than giving you $50 of foot exercises to do for the next 3 weeks and come back and see me,
Right.
So,
right.
Hey, I wanted to throw something else out there. Think of to our listeners, think of who's got big glutes: speed skaters, hockey players, sprinters. These folks have big glutes. Think of what they're doing. There's a lot of external rotation. There's a lot of hip abduction, and there's a lot of hip extension. Think of as a skater, and they're pushing the leg out to the side in abduction and external rotation and extension. That's the fiber orientation. We talked about those muscle groups increasing glute max involvement. When you fire into more hip abduction or external rotation, you get more activity on the EMG in the glute max. So, think about it. That's why we have people do diagonal monster walks. Have them stand up, go into their hip hinge, put a band around their knees, have them do a diagonal step with the left foot out to the left, and then lift the right foot and step out diagonally to the right forward, and then left forward, and then go backwards. These things are creating abduction, external rotation, and hip extension. The next progression, maybe have them do diagonal hops. That will, or just side-to-side hops, creating that glute into abduction and maybe some external rotation. So think of sumo squats and all these kinds of things. So this is not rocket science, but you can't start with that. And this is where most people make get themselves and their clients in trouble. They start to go for that big stuff when the client still can't even find the glute in a normal hip extension pattern or a modest split squat or something like that. So keep in mind, you got to get that skill first, and then you got to rep it out with endurance, and then you can go for these big players, these, the big movements, like the things that we're just talking about there, the squats and the monster walks and stuff like that. So just keep in mind that there's a logical process, and if you don't follow the logical process, you're probably building strength into faulty movement patterns, and it may be you that's responsible for their next injury because you overloaded a faulty movement pattern. Keep that in mind. Well, there's a lot of material we didn't cover here.
Well, I think that we have to have a part 2 of this podcast, just because
absolutely.
There's just, so much more stuff that we, just from the itinerary that we should talk about, but also just with other glute information and things like that. So
I think that's what we're going to do. We're going to do a part 2 on the glutes. This was glutes part 1, and we are just getting started. We're going to go into glutes part 2, so stay tuned for that. Hopefully podcast 120 we'll cover into that, and we'll expand a little bit. We'll go into the lumbothoracic canister. We'll go into knee and ankle and foot stuff and how that affects the glutes. So we'll try and bring this full circle for you guys. Sound good?
Sounds good to me.
And remember, folks, every third Wednesday we're online, CE or chirocredit.com if you want to get into some more of our stuff. We've also got those things online. You can download our catalog, and it's a nominal fee, and you can start taking some live lectures with videos and the PowerPoints and whatnot there. And like I said, we're going to start up some new stuff here, so there's going to be other ways of getting in touch with us. We actually were talking before the podcast about some ideas, Q&A sessions with you guys, live Q&A and stuff like that. So hang in there. We've got some great stuff coming in 2017 as we promised. We'll see you guys next time. Well, let's close shop here. I am Sean Allen in Chicago.
I have a whirl up in Dillon, Colorado. We will see you in the shoe aisle.